спасибо всем, кто к нам присоединился. Мы начинаем презентацию исследования
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. We'll be discussing today Belarusian identity in 2024. This research became possible thanks to the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, and the information support was provided by the Press Club Belarus. While in the past, during such surveys, we spoke about things that make people in Belarus different, and today we'll be talking about what unites Belarusians. Will be presented today Mr. Bikanau and Nesterovich, Philipp and Konstantin. Hello and welcome. If you have any questions, please write your questions in the chat. And before we start, I would like to give floor to representatives of the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation representative, Mr. Christopher Forst. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and welcome also from my side to all our guests. Once again, we're presenting our yearly study of Belarusian identity, and once again, FES supports it. I represent Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, Germany's oldest political foundation, committed to the values of freedom, solidarity, and justice. And it's unsurprising that, in our opinion, identity can be a very political question, and the conclusions that political actors, namely in this case representatives of the democracy movement, draw from these findings in terms of how to address the target audience are crucial for us. And would like to add here in the very beginning that something that has not changed over the years, according to our study, is that polarization of society is a key factor, and the very different clusters identified by Philipp and his team, as well as their relationship with each other, underline this, and this continues to worry me. To quote myself from 1 year ago, national identity should, in an ideal world, not be a polarizing topic, but one that can unite, that unites people behind a common vision how to design their common future. And for this reason, I really like that the second chapter of this study is called What Unites Belarusians. I'll be short and sharp this year, as I've shared some of my thoughts ahead of previous launches already. If you're interested in different aspects related to Belarusian identity, I would warmly recommend that you also look out for the previous editions of the Belarusian Identity Study in our FES digital library. Even though the methodology may have slightly changed, the fact that the research aspects of identity have as well means that you may get a more holistic understanding. And of course, I highly recommend you to read at least the full 2025 edition. The link will be shared with all of you. We are a bit late with this presentation. One of the reasons cited by Philipp was the decoupling from the media attention cycle surrounding these so-called presidential elections. I share this approach, and I hope you'll find the time to digest our researchers' findings slowly and thoroughly, and regard the analysis of what Belarusian identity means as a continuous exercise rather than a one-off study. I would like to thank Philipp and his team once again, as well as the Press Club Belarus, and I'm looking forward to the discussion of our fresh study now, of course also to your questions. Let me, of course, also thank my colleagues, especially Taras Michalniuk, who put a lot of work in this from our side, as I promised, short and sharp, so over to you. Thank you.
Спасибо большое. Слово Филиппу Биканову.
Thank you very much. Give floor to Philipp Bikanau. Good afternoon, colleagues. Dear guests, I'm very glad to see all of you today. I'm very glad that interest to the topic has been ongoing. I would like to say a few words of gratitude. I would like to thank the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation for the ongoing support for many years of our research of Belarus, Belarusianness, and Belarusians, or the opportunity to discuss what our future will look like, what the Belarusian national identity will look like in the future, and this year to focus on the cultural aspects of this issue, on the things that unites Belarusians. Every year we try to add something new to our research, and I'm very grateful to your support. I mean, the support of the foundation that understands very well of what we want to achieve in our work. That's great. This year, this research has been a success, and thus we have a lot of practical recommendations on how to fight with the negative Russian influence, including the cultural sphere. I would like to say that we've been working with Konstantin Nesterovich, well-known sociologist. I would like to thank Taras Mikhailuk from the foundation, for his work, and to colleagues. I would like to thank our colleagues from the Belarusian Press Club for giving us the platform to present our results. And here I would like to give floor to my colleague, Konstantin. Hello everyone, thank you very much for joining us today. I will now share my presentation. I will tell you more about our findings. First and foremost, I would like to say a few words about our methodology. I will briefly comment on it. We use the standard approach that is used for data collection also for other colleagues. We recruited respondents through the online panel, opt-in panel. We surveyed Belarusians that are currently living in Belarus with a sample being 800 people. We conducted the survey at the beginning of December last year. You need to consider the following things to understand our survey. We surveyed only urban population and people 18 to 64 years old. So older generation and the people from the rural areas are not represented in our sample, only because we didn't survey them through the online survey. So I'm not going to go too deep into methodology. If you have some questions, I'll be happy to answer them later. I will now present the contents of our research. There'll be 4 blocks, 4 topics that we're going to cover. The first one is about the division of segments according to the national identity. This is our traditional instrument that we regularly use to measure the specificity of the national identity. The second section is about what unites people. There are elements that unite Belarusians as usual, not only things that divide Belarusians. So the third section focuses on the Russian cultural influence on Belarusians. In other words, I'll tell you how much Belarusians consume Russian cultural content, how they perceive it. And the fourth section will be dedicated to the issue of the Belarusian language, its perception by the population, etc. Now, let's talk about the first section. I'll tell you about our standard tool or instrument. We usually view the Belarusian national identity through the prism of the 4 components. These components are singled out by the factor analysis in the following way. We give the respondents 26 statements we present to them that are connected with the ideas about the Belarusian nation, and we want them to agree or disagree with those statements. Depending on the answers and how they correlate between each other, using the factor analysis, we single out 4 groups. And each component has the answers that correlate better with each other. Thus, for example, if a person is inclined to believe that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a great tragedy, then there's a big chance that that very person would believe that Russians and Belarusians are very similar. In this way, we should understand these components. So, hidden intentions in identity and groups are all connected. The Russian-Soviet component reflects the orientation towards the Soviet past and the idea that Belarusians should live in a close connection with Russians. The Belarusian component covers the ideas that they are Belarusian national culture, Belarusian language are important things. The national different component reflects the indifference to the national topics. It is characteristics of people who believe that in today's world the national difference is more of a additional barrier that divides people rather than something that unites them. And cosmopolitan component reflects the interest towards the global identity. So these are the people that very often are interested in the events all around the globe, want to have ties with people all around the world, want to learn about new cultures. So this is special outlook. Compared to the earlier waves, we worked further on these components. For example, in the past, the Belarusian component was closely tied to the attitude to the Belarusian language. This time, we added the historical aspect. For example, there's a statement about the Orsha battle and Grunwald battle, that the Belarusians should be proud of these battles and the role of Belarusians there. And of course, the Belarusian language also played an important role, a central role in this component. These are our four major components, and depending on how each of the components is characteristic of Belarusians, they can be divided into 5 segments: conscious, emerging, indifferent, Soviet, Russified. I'll tell you in a few words what each segment means. On the diagram, you see that the conscious are characterized as a bigger cosmopolitanism. These are the people who are interested both in the local national culture and the other cultures all around the world. At the same time, they have a very weak Soviet component and an indifferent component. The Soviet segment is a segment that can be characterized by the Soviet component, and others component are at the middle, somewhere in the middle. Because cosmopolitanism, Belarusianness, and national indifference, even national indifference is not characteristic of them. And between these components, among them there is a group called emergent. They're marked in green, somewhere in the middle, between the other segment. And there's another segment called the indifferent, which unites people that have the highest national indifference, that they don't care that much about their national differences. At the same time, to the measure to which they agree to the different components, they feel that the Soviet component is close to them, the Belarusian one. The Russified is a separate group. It is special in the way that these are people who do not believe themselves to be Belarusians. So, answering the question, what kind of nationality they are, they don't opt for Belarusians, they opt for Russians. So, they have a strong national indifference component to a degree. When they would opt for the Soviet national identity instead of others. In this respect, they're very much similar with the indifferent, the group of the indifferent. These segments have also been singled out using the cluster analysis, and here we see that the sizes of this segment are very conditional. If we see all the respondents in the space of points, so that's all very conventional relative. 2 points between which there's a segment border, they're very much more similar between each other than the representatives of other groups, which means that if there is a slight difference in answers, the segments move around, so they should be understood as the profiles. as the ideal types in the Belarusian society. But we don't know the true measures of these segments, and we just judge by them relative to one another. For example, we see that the segment of the emerging constitutes about a fourth of our sample, just the same as the Soviet, and the size similar to the indifferent. So at the same time, the segment of the conscious is a bit smaller in this, so in the Belarusian society, and the smallest one is the group called the Russified. So the major message here about the cluster analysis is that this is just a statistical model that simplifies the reality of the Belarusian society, but still helps us to understand it better. I'll tell you more now about the segments, because by singling out the segments based on the statements, we view them in the framework of the concept of the national segments. It's based on the constructivist view that, according to which the modern nations and the major role is played by the cultural movements that offer different view. So they have different views on the place of the nations in the history. And traditionally, two projects are singled out here: Belarusian nations
чаще всего можно встретить в официальной коммуникации текущей власти и который строится на преемственности с советским прошлым.
It's built on the succession of the Soviet, and next to the National Romantic Project.
Тут я могу сослаться на пример «Борьба вокруг идентичности», где она
refer to the book by Alibekov, where she describes these national Belarusian projects. But similar movements were singled out by different researchers by analyzing text of intellectuals and analyzing the mass communication, the mass media. So these projects are indeed widely represented by the cultural discourse, cultural narrative in Belarus. So we did not come up with this context and the importance of these two projects. But the added value of our research here is that we analyzed how these projects exist at the level of a mass conscience, at the level of statistics of big groups of people. Here we see the correspondence between the segments of the conscious and similarity in the national romantic projects. So if we imagine the Belarusian national identity in its as a symbolic space where different symbols, ideas, rituals are presented, the group of the conscious will feel proximity to the Grunwald battle, Kostuś-Kalinowski movement, symbols of the chase, the rituals of Dyady and Freedom Day. Overall, they feel that this history and language are very important for them compared to other segments. This is the basis of the romantic project of the Belarusian nation. At the same time, the Soviet project is the segment which is connected.
Скорее, государство является таким элементом,
for them, the state is the element that unites the society. For them, at the same time, the emotional connection is more important. The symbolic space is the Belaruskaya Pushcha, the brands of the state enterprises, the Slaviansky Bazaar and 9th of May celebrations, and the national flag, red and green. And this is the only segment which can be connected to the fact that the ideas and of the Belarusian nation. Between these segments, between these competing projects is the emergent segment. It's an interesting segment that can be in both actively consuming cultural information. They visit museums very often, both official and traditional, that are more characteristic of the national romantic project. And maybe this openness, its interest of those two projects has to do with the fact that this is the youngest segments. The two remaining segments are the indifferent, the fallout of this competition. Overall, the indifferent are not interested in both national projects, in either national projects. They see the Belarusian as the community of united around the citizenship, territory, self-identification, symbols that they like is the Draniki and the Nesterovich Castle and the National Library. Possibly this weak cultural involvement is connected to the fact that very often they are people without a higher education, so vocational training or the secondary education. So the conscious group people have higher education. Usually, the different segment is different. And the Russified segment is very similar to the indifferent segment. They believe themselves to be Russians. So they're not interested in the Belarusian National Romantic Project at all. I told you about how Belarusians are different, and these differences are quite stable. They've been around for 5 years. I mean, we have not been noticing them for 5 years. Despite the competition of this national project, Belarusians still exist as a whole nation. And in the next few minutes, I'll tell you about the elements of the national identity that are similar and that are common for these segments. What unites them? Out of the previous analysis, we know that Belarusians have different components connected with the national identity, but the fact that the Belarusians think differently about the nation, that they have different components in their mind, doesn't mean that they're enemies toward each other. And to understand how Belarusians treat each other, we analyzed how they accept or do not accept. These manifestations. By non-acceptance, I mean that when we talk about the Belarusian component, it could mean that a person would not want people who speak Belarusian on a regular basis, the Belarusian language on a regular basis, to work in the mass media or to have a high state post. And while acceptance on the means that these people should believe that the people speaking Belarusian language should not be excluded from society. So here we see that in terms of Belarusian components in all the segments, the acceptance is more widely manifested, except for the group of the indifferent and the Russified, who are not particularly decided. They are undecided. A similar situation is with the cosmopolitan component. Here, the majority of the segments are in the green zone. Overall, they accept the manifestation. They don't want to exclude people with these manifestations from the public life. except the people of the indifferent from the different group. A different, we see it different with the Soviet group. Here, the Soviet group, they accept this component, but with the conscious group, they do not accept this manifestation of the Soviet component. Thus, the specialties of the Belarusian identity are polarizing. They show that some people are ready to accept it, others are not. They don't want to see any manifestations like that. And the difference here, again, all means that all the segments are neutral to the manifestations of indifference, except for the conscious, for the group of the conscious, that find it very important. They find the language, the culture very important. And all these manifestations of the national romantic projects as such. So they would rather not accept indifference. Thus, the manifestations of the Soviet and the indifferent components, they lead to the social tensions, the polarizing views about these manifestations, while the manifestations of the Belarusianness and cosmopolitanism are accepted by the majority of the segments. And the fact that this acceptance exists does not mean that these elements are a unifying factor for all the Belarusians, but they have potential to become such a unification. Thus, if some political movements want to overcome this identity division in the Belarusian society, the elements that are characteristic of the Belarusianness and cosmopolitanism can be used by them. This is the major conclusion of this slide, but I will dwell a little more upon it, because as a very important things that need to be mentioned. There are three statements that are characteristic of the Belarusian components. The people, they speak Belarusian language, actively support the development of Belarusian national culture, and want for Belarusian language to be more widespread in the society. They don't have any trigger things, this component, like the white, red, white flag and others. If we added it there, that would be much less accepted by the Soviet components. But where are the key factors here, based on the statistical analysis? And vice versa, in the Soviet component, we added the triggering topics like the attitude to the people who actively support the unification of Russia and Belarus. Consequently, if there was no such trigger statement, there will be less acceptance towards these components from the conscious, but still this non-acceptance would remain, because if we go deeper in such components, we'll see that among the conscious, the 70% of people want to exclude from the public life people who are in favor of uniting Belarus and Russia into one state. At the same time, over 50% want to exclude people who are simply being nostalgic about the Soviet past and believe that the Soviet Union collapse is a big tragedy. So here, even though there's a trigger political component, it reflects the nature of the relationship. And the last commentary about this slide, very briefly, we see the Soviet group of the Soviets has a similar acceptance of the three major components of the cosmopolitan, Belarusian, and Soviet, and it confirms our conclusion from other research that the Soviet is not the anti-Belarusian segment. They're okay with the manifestations of the Belarusianness, but they see it in the framework of the different tradition. After we spoke about the components at the abstract level, let's move to the how these intentions and views are manifested at the levels of concrete cultural notions and manifestations. Well, let's talk about the cuisine, music, literature, and Belarusian brands. And the first thing I want to talk about is music. We asked open questions to the Belarusians of our sample. We asked them about the Belarusian music that is common to all Belarusians. And people could write in any band or any performer. And here we see that the leader here is the band Pisnyari. This band is very often considered the music that is known and loved by all the Belarusians, that unites all the Belarusians. And we see that is characteristic of all the segments. Its band is a leader in all the segments, but the group of the indifferent stands out, which is normal, because it's the segment that has the less active cultural consumption of cultural material. And the next is the brightest, which is similar to the music. Here, two persons stand out in all the segments except the indifferent. These are Yanka Kupala and Jakub Kolas. Here, I would like to add that the first wave of the research that happened in 2020, when we asked people who would be the embodiment of the ideal Belarusian, Jakub Kolas and Yanka Kupala were the most popular answers. Among the national cuisine dishes, we see the number one is draniki. Usually find it difficult to write their own dish. It's much easier for them to make a selection from what they're offered. But which means that in this case they had to write down the name of the dish, which means that it's the dish that is well known to majority of the people. The conclusions can be made here. First, if the communication use the image that it's understood by all the Belarusians, we can use the image of draniki as a national dish. On the other hand, if draniki are dominated so much, so if there's a desire to enrich the understanding of the Belarusian cuisine, we should consider other dishes more seriously. National brands, the Belarusian brands, the brands that work in Belarus, are also an important part of the national identity of Belarus. For example, I can refer to the research by Maria Rogova, who used focus groups to show that if a person wants to explain to a foreigner who Belarusians are, so one of the ways to do that is to mention Belarusian brands, to draw associations there. Consequently, our research here would add that probably among such brands are such brands as Kommunarka and Bilaz. Here we see much more percentage points than compared with other brands. It was a closed question and a multiple choice. So let's talk about the next section, about the Russian cultural influence. I will talk more about the culture, but under the influence of what? How much Belarusians consume of Belarusian cultural content and how to perceive this trend. We have analyzed the cultural consumption in 6 aspects. Stand-up comedians, bloggers, books, performances, music, and cinema. We asked people an open questions and asked them, what are your favorite representative of all these segments? And people could write down any names, last name of stand-up comedian, for example, or the name of the movie they like. When we encoded these replies, depending on the country, and we calculated the share, and we saw that the Russian content is dominating in the field of stand-up comedy. Belarusians prefer Russian stand-up comedians much more often than the Belarusian ones. And the same is true in the sphere of bloggers. The Russian content and Russian bloggers are at the top. At the same time, we cannot conclude that overall the Russian content, cultural content dominates in those, because in the segments of the movies and music, we see the domination of the old Soviet films and Western films in the movies, and in the music segment we see it's the Russian music and Western music dominate. Even in the segment of the Soviet, the Western movies are at the top of the list. This is one of the kinds of movies they prefer. So the conclusion here is that the Russian influence can be felt, and it's very significant, particularly in the categories of the stand-up comedy and bloggers, but it's not absolutely dominating. It's also the Western and Belarusian influence, cultural influence, are also significant. Here we decided to explore the reasons why Belarusians are consuming Belarusian content. We analyzed the segments of music and cinema. So we asked the respondents, using a special question, we wanted to find out why Belarusians believe that the Russian movies and Russian music are cool. And we saw the Russian films and Russian music are preferred by the Belarusians because it's culturally close, because it's in the same language the Belarusians understand, Belarusians speak. Also, we asked the respondents why one wouldn't like Russian movies and Russian music. And here, at the top of the list of the reasons, the negative characteristics that this is low quality. Propaganda here is 8%. So people don't like Russian movies because it has some propaganda, while over 20% of the respondents believe that the Russian content is not great because it's low quality, bad plot, and it's very stereotypical. So if you want to fight the Russian propaganda using the Russian culture, the argument could be used is not that it's a propaganda, but because it's bad quality. The content is not particularly interesting and it's not well made. And the final section, the perception of the Belarusian language. At first, we tried to analyze how much Belarusians are using Belarusian language in order to communicate and in order to express their identity. Overall, we understood that we understand the identity as a set of markers or cultural categories that people use to identify or classify themselves and others. Roughly speaking, This is how and why Belarusians believe other people are Belarusian as well. And we see that in this aspect of the national identity, the Belarusian language has almost no place, occupies almost no place. So Belarusian language is not actually used to identify Belarusians by other Belarusians. Just because on a regular basis it's used by a smaller number of people and based on language people are using, it's hard to understand whether they're Belarusian or not. A similar story can be seen involving the language as the marker. I'm sorry, we mixed here some parts of the presentation, headlines. We asked them the question about why Belarusians consider themselves Belarusians, what makes them Belarusian? What makes them closer to other Belarusians? And here we see that the language was mentioned by only 20%, and it's the birthplace, the territory, and the culture play a much bigger role. Here we can make a conclusion that compared to other elements of the identity, the language is not that important for Belarusians as a part of the national identity, and probably it has to do with the fact that people are not using it that much on a regular basis in their daily lives. At the same time, there's a small share of Belarusians for whom the Belarusian language is important because from time to time they speak it, or believe this is their national mother tongue. In other countries, up to 90% of the population can say that the language is the important marker that defines a person belonging to this or that nation. It is particularly in the countries where the national language is the main means of communication. Probably the situation with the role of the Belarusian language in the identity can change if there are more native speakers of Belarusian language. But we can influence the situation now by improving its image. The new analysis. This is a new analysis that wasn't conducted in the previous waves of research. It shows the image map of the Belarusian language. On the axis, on the Y, you see that the promotion of Belarusian language, how much each attribute contributes or prevents the development of the Belarusian language. So the people would like to use it more. And on X, we see the share of the Belarusians who believe that this the Belarusian language is characterized by the following. We see that about 54% believe that the Belarusian language is unique. This is how this map should be read and perceived. It has 4 major segments. And we see the main drivers of popularizing the Belarusian language today are the perception that it's the native language, that it's unique, that it's beautiful. Among those that negatively influence the Belarusian language are that it has the image of the rural language, and the most important thing that should be considered in this map is the yellow segment that shows that the perception of the Belarusian language of being the language of youth, of the language of intelligentsia, is really a big contributing factor to development of the improved image of the Belarusian language.
При этом довольно мало людей
At the same
считают,
time, there are
что
very few
эти
people believe that
характеристики
these are characteristics that
подходят для белорусского языка.
fit the Belarusian language very well. Thus,
Если есть задача как-то продвигать
if there's a
белорусский
task
язык,
to
то
promote the
мы
Belarusian language,
должны усиливать его
we need
ассоциации,
to
продвигать
increase,
имидж того, что это язык
improve
молодежи,
its
язык
image
интеллигенции.
as being the language of intelligentsia and the young people.
Про будущее белорусского языка.
A few words about the future of the Belarusian
Несмотря
language.
на то, что сегодня
Even
на
though
постоянной основе
today, on a
решают
regular
белорусы
basis, only
использовать
a
белорусский язык,
small percentage of people in Belarus are
очень
using
малый
Belarusian
процент
language,
хочет дальнейшей русификации, то есть мы видим,
very
что
few people
приблизительно
want a further Russification of Belarus.
10%
10 to
это
15%
людей,
of the
которые
people,
хотели бы,
respondents,
чтобы было русского языка больше
would like to
во
have
всех
more
сферах
Russian
народа,
language in various
наоборот,
spheres of the Belarusian life.
хотят, чтобы было
It's the other way
больше
around. More people would like to have 20 to 30%
и
would like to have more Belarusian language in various spheres, and
оно, соответственно, очень сильно связано с желанием. То есть это не просто люди
it
считают,
has
что
to
он
do
станет
with the
популярным, а они в то же время и хотели бы в какой-то мере, чтобы он стал
desire of
популярным.
people to become
Видим, что
Belarusian language to
будет
become
больше
popular.
тех,
See
кто
that
считает, что он
there are more people like that
будет
than
менее
those who
популярным.
believe the Belarusian language should be less
Вот,
popular.
здесь такая история. Но в целом, как бы наибольшую
Overall,
долю, такое,
the major
можно сказать,
part,
самое популярное мнение, то
major
что
share
сейчас,
here, the most popular opinion is that
сейчас достаточно белорусского
today
языка, что и в
there is
будущем,
enough
хотелось бы,
Belarusian
чтобы
language
оставалось так же.
in the society,
И
and
интересно, что вот это про то, что
there shouldn't be
сейчас
less.
достаточный уровень распространения
It's
белорусского
interesting though,
языка наиболее характерно для сегмента советских. И это вот еще раз
the
показывает,
segment, the
что это
Soviet shows
сегмент,
that
который, в принципе, хорошо относится к белорусскому языку, они не хотят больше русского, они хотят, чтобы белорусский исчез.
they don't want the Belarusian
В
language
той
to
мере, как он
disappear.
сегодня
They don't
представлен,
want
а
to
он
have
все-таки
more of the
представлен
Russian
в
language,
Беларуси сегодня.
and they're fine with
Достаточно.
how the Belarusian language is represented currently in the
И
society.
в конце
It's enough for them.
4
And
минуты, 3 резюмирую
I'll try
основные
to
выводы.
conclude now
То
the
есть
main
первое, к чему мы пришли, это то,
findings.
что белорусская
First and
и
foremost is that the
космополитическая
Belarusian and
компонента — это
cosmopolitan components are potentially unifying
потенциально
once
объединяющие компоненты для всех
for all
белорусов,
Belarusians,
независимо от сегмента,
while
а наоборот
a
советская — это
Soviet
скорее
is
поляризующие
more of a polarizing one.
компоненты. В то же время мы видим, что
At the same time, we
несмотря на
see that
разделение, есть целый
despite the
пласт культур,
divisions, there's the
которые
whole
общие
layer
для
of
всех белорусов,
cultural
которые
layer
объединяют
that is
белорусов в
common
разных
for Belarusians,
сегментах.
that unites
Истории,
Belarusians from different segments,
Колос,
like the
Драники,
Песняры,
Колас.
Драники, Коммунарка, Белас,
Российское влияние
Kupala, and Kolas. The Russian
белорусов
influence of
заметно и сильно, однако далеко не доминирует.
is strong, particularly
Доминирует
in
среди
the cultural segment, but it's not
комиков,
dominating,
в кино,
apart from the stand-up comedy and
доминирует скорее западный и белорусский контент.
while in the music and the
Также
movies, the Belarusian
язык
and the Western
это то, что
content is dominating,
примерно
and the
русские тоже
language segment,
хотели бы,
half of the Belarusians would want
чтобы распространенность белорусского языка была примерно на том же уровне, что и
the
сейчас,
Belarusian language
поскольку для них
stay in the same
язык не
level,
является важной
because
частью
for them,
идентичности.
Belarusian language is not a major part of their
Спасибо
identity.
за внимание.
And that's it from me. Thank you.
Спасибо большое за вашу
Thank you very much
презентацию.
for your
Уже
presentation.
есть вопросы.
We already have
И первый из
questions.
них
The first one
традиционно,
being,
как вы находите желающих
traditionally,
участвовать в вопросе во
and
времена
how do you find
тотального
the
страха?
people willing to
Как
participate in your
достигается
surveys
аудитория внутри
in the
Беларуси?
times of the total fear? How do you find people inside Belarus? Konstantin would like to answer.
Есть, чтобы я 3
Maybe
минуты
you
передохнул.
will answer for me to have rest.
Вопрос действительно традиционный, действительно
Indeed,
стандартный.
it's a standard question that we are being asked.
Смотрите, мы опрашиваем участников
We
с помощью онлайн-панелей. Это такие
use the online
сайты, в
panel.
которых регистрируются белорусы.
These are the sites
Вот.
where
Ну, в Беларуси,
Belarusians
естественно,
register
белорусы, а
in
вообще
Belarus.
практика мировая во всем мире с целью поучаствовать в
It
вопросе.
actually happens all over the world.
К этим сайтам есть доступ изнутри Беларуси.
These websites are
Сайты
accessible
не
from
берут
inside Belarus. They do not
информации о имени, фамилии,
use
номере
the
телефона,
information,
местоположении
personal
участника. Ну, то есть
information,
кто-то
name
может
and
захотеть это
last
оставить.
name of the
Нет,
participants.
в этом
Somebody,
не
people who want to
обязательно. Вот. И
mention it can do that, but
приглашение в
it's not a must.
онлайн-панели
The
не
invitation
называет
and
тему
the
исследования.
online
То есть
panel does
участник
not
просто получает приглашение
mention the
поучаствовать
name
в
of
исследовании.
the research, the
Кроме
topic of the
этого,
research.
мы
Also, we
естественно, ваши опасения и опасения всех, кто про это говорил,
of course,
основаны
the
на очень
fears
реальных вещах,
here are based on the real
репрессиях и
things
наверняка
like
есть
repression
достаточно
in
много людей,
Belarus.
которые
Of
действительно
course, there's the
не взяли
number
бы
of
участие
people
в
in
исследованиях,
Belarus
но
who would not participate
мы
in such
стараемся
research.
делать наши
But
опросы,
we
снижать
try
сенситивность,
to
говоря профессиональным языком, то есть
bring down the
задавать
sensitivity of
вопросы
our
определенным
research,
образом, чтобы не пугать
to
людей,
ask
да,
people questions
не заставлять
so
их
that not to
говорить
make
какие-то
them afraid,
вещи, которые
not to force them to say
потенциально могли
things that
бы показаться им
potentially
опасными,
would
например,
feel dangerous
которые
to
могли бы
them
привести их за
or
решетку в
who could
случае, если бы что.
uh,
Фактор страха, то, о чем вы говорите, он действительно
make them
влияет.
go to jail. The factor
Я
of
и
the fear
Константин, и
indeed affects such
Ростопени, наш
people.
коллега, мы
With
посвятили
Rostopenia, me and
достаточно
Konstantin,
много
we
времени
spent
изучению этого
enough
вопроса.
time
Вот, и в целом эффект
to,
действительно есть, он
to this
заметен.
issue.
Многие
Indeed, the
писали
effect is there.
острые вопросы,
It's noticeable.
считали, что за
We
счет такого
calculated
страха
that
искажения в результатах можно
the
достигать
fear factor can
50%, да, то есть это как бы много.
amend and
В то же
negatively
время
influence
это
the
результат
results of
исследования
the
он не
research
переворачивает.
up,
В то же
up
время
to
в
10%.
вопросах, связанных с менее
At the same
сенситивными
time,
темами,
the
такими как
less sensitive
использование, любовь к белорусскому
questions,
языку,
like
да,
the
которая,
love to the affection to the Belarusian language,
как мы видим и как Константин представил, это не эксклюзивно
these are not include
антилукашенковская черта. Вот
anti-Lukashenko
в таких
trade.
вопросах эффект еще ниже,
Here,
потому что они менее
the effect is
страшные.
even less because they're not
Гораздо
less fearsome.
сильнее, я бы сказал, искажение за счет того, какая это выборка, да, что это онлайн-выборка,
There
и
is some
критиковать
influence on the
сравнение
sample
с этой
because it's an online
стороны, мне
sample.
кажется, потому что доступ к... Это очень специфические профессиональные вопросы, да,
Because some
проверяют
questions
сути
are
выборки, что она
very specific,
невероятностна, да, это
professional,
онлайн-панель, и в
and has a
онлайн-панели
distortion.
есть
The
смещение
online
в сторону
panel
более
has some
образованных людей, людей, которые умеют пользоваться
bias
интернетом,
towards
людей,
the
которые
more
знают, что
advanced
такое
people, more
онлайн-панель,
well-educated
оно вот
people
это
who
более
use
правильное,
internet
мне
on a regular
кажется.
basis, who use
Так что
can use the panel.
наши результаты, скорее всего, отличаются от того, что есть
Our
действительно.
results are probably different to what
Если бы мы
the society
имели
is as
возможность
such.
сделать интервью, например,
And if
face-to-face,
we could
или
take
другими,
face-to-face
то остальные
interviews, the
феномены в
replies
обществе
could
точно
be a bit different.
существуют. И,
But the
наверное,
phenomena that
можно
we
говорить о том,
described
что
do exist in society. We can say that
сопоставление этих размеров, оно скорее такое, но
the
та
proportion
статистика,
is
которую я говорил, она
similar.
скорее пессимизировала бы результаты для, как минимум для
But
того, кто
we
задал
don't want
этот
to get
вопрос, потому что
pessimistic here.
в офлайне
Because in the
мы, например, вообще
offline,
не трогаем сельское население, которое
we, for example,
множество есть
we
исследований
don't
говорит,
touch upon the
где более
rural
консервативные, например,
people who are much more conservative, I would say.
которые чаще доверяет, например,
Who trust more
властным
often
структурам и так далее.
the authorities.
Поэтому достигаем, как бы,
So
конечно,
we
репрессивные политики не помогают нам работать, но
must say that repressive
не нужно
policies
ставить крест
do
на
not help us work,
опросных
but
методах в Беларуси.
I think we shouldn't give up on the
Есть еще вопрос.
surveys in Belarus.
Так,
There another
вопрос
question
Позирк.
from Pozirk.
Ага. Использование русского языка в
The
графике
use of the Russian
88%
language
чаще всего и 93 время от
in
времени. Это
graph.
не ошибка ли? Может
Is
быть,
that a
использовать чаще
mistake
всего
regarding
и
the Russian language use
20% время от времени? Так,
on
я
one of
не
your
так следила
slides?
за графиками.
Я могу пояснить.
I can explain it.
Сейчас транслирую.
I'm
Этот
currently
экран расшарен до сих пор.
sharing my screen.
Да, я транслирую сейчас этот слайд, про который идет речь.
I'm showing the slide that is
Не совсем очевидно, как читается эта диаграмма.
maybe it's not obvious how the diagram should be read. We actually cannot see the slide.
Расшариваю.
Let me do it again.
Так, вот. Теперь должно быть видно.
You
Вот,
should
в
see it
общем,
now.
вопрос про
So the question was
что
about
изображено вот на этих, на
what
этой
can be
диаграмме.
seen at this diagram,
Его
right?
следует читать таким образом.
It should be read in the following way.
Длина вот этого бара
The length of this bar
показывает, что 93%
shows that the 93%
белорусов
of Belarusians
время от времени
from time to
используют
time use
русский язык
Russian language, Among them, including 88%, are the people who use it more often than not. The same is true about the Belarusian. More often it's used by 11%, plus there are 44% of people who use it from time to time. So 55% overall. This is how this diagram should be read. Thank you very much. The next question about the graph. The love to the... It's interesting that 11% of Belarusians like the Russian movies for being stupid and tasteless. Is that, how can you explain it? I would like to say a few words about methodology here. Here we use not only the direct questions, but the projecting question. We describe the situation to the respondent. Let's say, imagine you have a relative coming to your place, you're discussing various topics at the dinner. Now you're discussing cinema, and your relative says that I don't like Russian cinema because, and they need to continue and write how and why the Russian cinema may not be liked. So this was our way of finding out why Belarusians dislike Russian movies, which means that we have 23% of people who believe the Russian movies may not be liked because, or may be liked because they're about people like us. At the same time, we had 11% of people who said that, well, my relative of mine likes Russian movies because he lacks taste or because he or she is stupid. And here it means that these people treat the Russian content negatively. So they don't like this content and believe it's tasteless and there's nothing to like it for. It's only liked by stupid and tasteless people. And this reply was given by the segment of the emergent and the conscious. In other words, the people who are much more involved in the cultural consumption. Has to do with the fact that they just said that there's nothing like the Russian films about for. Is there a difference between the national identity of Belarusians inside Belarus and outside Belarus, in exile? Can you compare those things, and have you researched it? So can these results that you're showing to us today be projected to Belarusians in exile? Well, I can guess here that in the previous waves of this research, we could see the connection of between the national segment in terms of the trust and distrust. So there's quite a lot of the connection between leaving Belarus and people having certain political views. Even the most conservative evaluations say that from 30 to 35% have left on account of political reasons, particularly the use of humanitarian visas issued. And 30% is quite a lot. So we can think that, we can believe that people who leave Belarus will probably in this segment emergent or the conscious in our research based on their political views. At the same time,
белорусская диаспора это уже
The Belarusian
сотни тысяч
diaspora
людей, и,
involves hundreds of thousands of people,
скорее всего, там,
and
ну, там
inside of
действительно, я
it,
думаю, перепредставлен вот, по сравнению с Беларусью, внутри
there's
Беларуси
an
представитель сегмента сознательного,
overrepresentation of the conscious
но
segment compared
сказать
to the
какое-то
conscious segment in
конкретное
Belarus.
распределение пропорций дать,
But
к сожалению, сейчас
it's
не могу.
impossible to think
Один
about
вопрос.
the clear-cut proportion.
Два слова вставлю. Могу на эту тему посоветовать исследование
I'd like
нашего
to
коллеги
add that
Геннадия
I
Коршунова
would
на
like
сайте
to
Центра новых идей, опубликованное в статье
suggest
национальной идентичности, где
reading the Mr.
выборки
Korshinov
современных
research about
цифрового
national identity that
животных в
involved
Беларуси и тех, кто
samples of
возможно,
Belarusians
там
inside the country and
можно
outside. Maybe there you will find
здесь
some differences between these two
ссылку
groups.
я скинул в чат.
I posted the link
Спасибо.
in the chat.
Так, питание из чата. Вы рассказываете про советское
Question from the
мышление.
chat. You told us about the Soviet
самореплікація советскості. 30-40-годовые люди ці народилися у
point of
Республіці
view,
Беларусь.
and where does it
Ці
come from?
народилися на схилі СССР і його не пам'ятають. А свободу
Maybe
усіх
some people
Але
were
наразі
born
про советське
right after the
мислення
collapse of the Soviet Union,
притягується.
but
Це гаворка про вельми сталих людей і
what do you mean by the
як
Soviet segment?
виглядає
Are these the
варіант?
old generation?
Я думаю, могу попробовать ответить на этот вопрос. В
I
сегменте
think
советских у нас
I will answer this question. The segment of the Soviet,
52% людей,
we
которые
had
старше
52%
45.
that are over 45 years old.
То есть действительно в нем
Indeed,
преобладает. Это наиболее
we see
старший
here,
сегмент.
this is the oldest segment.
Люди
When you
45
see it is dominated by the 45 plus
18-24,
people,
25
while the 18 to
меньше
24, 25 to 30
Вот.
four
Но дело, скорее всего, не только в
segments are less
возрасте.
represented. But it's not only about the age.
Исследования, где
There is a
анализируется,
survey
например,
that systematically
стейтменты политической белорусской власти или
analyzes the
контент-СМИ.
statements of the Belarusian authorities or the mass media content.
И эти исследования показывают, что
And
ностальгия по
this research
СССР,
shows
апелляция к советскому
that
прошлому, она
the
воспроизводится
nostalgia about the Soviet past that's been replicated.
такие представления,
These are the
которые
ideas that
могли получить только те люди, которые жили тогда, во время БССР.
were not
но
necessarily
также те,
characteristics of
кто
people who lived during the Soviet times,
сейчас в
but
современной
also
Беларуси и
characteristics of
активно
people
потребляют вот этот
living in modern Belarus
контент,
who are actively consuming the content
и в
that is
официальном дискурсе
produced by
общественного
various state media and can be seen and heard in the
Цікаво було
official
побачити
discourse.
динаміку змін по годах.
It would be nice to see the
Наприклад, ці
dynamics of the
этого
changes
возможно,
starting from 1991.
Я там
Is
в
that
чаті
possible?
адказав господару Северину, що, на жаль,
I answered in the
менавіта
chat to this question.
вось праз такую
Unfortunately,
прызму мы глядзім не так давно.
we have been using this
З 2020-го.
approach not long ago, not for a long time.
Трошки нам
Since 2020, we had some changes in our approaches and our methodology,
казаць менавіта про такую супердакладную
which
дынаміку.
doesn't allow
З
us to talk about
1991
this super
года
concrete and
даследаванні беларускай ідэнтычнасці
dynamics.
былі.
The Belarusian identity has
Калі
been explored
напісалі
before.
беларускай
There was
ідэнтычнасці,
some
частка пытанняў, напрыклад,
quantitative
мы
research,
ёй карысталіся, але
qualitative research,
праз змену ў метадзе збору
but
дадзеных, напрыклад, казаць пра нешта супердакладнае таксама не
because of the
выпадае.
change
Вось,
in methodology, we cannot,
раней,
as I
да,
said before,
2020-го я не памятаю, каб колькаснымі
talk about the
метадамі нехта
clear difference between the previous research.
вось, напрыклад, сегменты па нацыянальнай
I don't
ідэнтычнасці.
remember anyone dividing the
Корпус
society into
прац
segments that we did.
вялікі, і можна,
So there's a big number of works
пачытаўшы, пааналізаваўшы, зрабіць пэўныя
on this topic,
высновы.
and by
Вось,
reading all them, you
напрыклад,
can make certain
гэтыя
conclusions, for
штуки, што мы
example.
кажам,
What we
нацпраектамі, гэта
call the national
дакладная
projects
рэч, якая з'явілася ў 2020,
are indeed
гэта пісалі даўно, вось, і
not something that appeared in 2020.
Нелі Бекус, напрыклад, дуже добра расказала
It was described in before.
1998 хіба годзе. Вось
Okay,
пра
Nalibek described it in 1998 about the official and alternative Belarusianness.
Таму пэўныя
Thus,
пэўныя рэчы можна параўнаць,
some things can be compared,
не лічбава, скажем так, не
but
ў процентах.
not in terms of numbers or percentages.
Следующий вопрос о том, что
Next question about the the Soviet being polarizing, but at the same time they accept cosmopolitanism and they treat well the conscious. So what's the polarization effect here? The polarization here is that there are Belarusians that positively think about the manifestations of the Soviet, and there are Belarusians that would want it to the carriers of the Soviet culture to be excluded from the public life, not to be working in the media, not occupying the positions, important positions. And here, this isolation, the main segment that is in favor of this is the segment called the conscious. It's the only segment that is in the red zone. So we can say this is the segment that dislikes other Belarusians because of their national identity traits. We can explain it by the political context. Currently, there's a certain persecution of the conscious group because this segment is very much carrier of the pro-democratic views. So they feel themselves being persecuted by the state and by authorities, and thus they feel this social tension because they being on the receiving end of the repression, they believe in that it's not totally safe to live in Belarus for them. So they transfer this negative influence, negative attitude to the state, to the proponents of the ideas that are similar to those of the state. So the carriers of the Soviet component. As a result, this creates a polarization and division. So there's a segment of people that do not accept the Soviet manifestations of the Sovietness, while there's no such attitude towards the Belarusian opponents. Maybe it has to do with the fact that, and other research shows that representatives of the other camps, they simply don't know that the repression is still going on, repressions are still there, and they don't feel this social tension, unlike the conscious segment. So they feel that the Sovietness is not particularly that stressful for them. That's it for me. There's a question about the dynamics. I'm interested in the dynamics of the change of the national identity starting from 2020. I think this is a very wide question, but maybe can you briefly comment on it? Kostya, would you like to answer? Answer that. So these are the traits.
Я перепрошую, ці чуваць нешта апроч мяне,
So can you hear something? Because they're sowing the trees outside and can be quiet.
Ми зробили перше дослідження ось у
Quite loud. So we made the first survey in 2020 before the elections in March or May.
Ось там так само визначилися гэтыя сегменты, мы тады іх трошки
we saw the segments there. We described them in a different way. We did not single out diversified. We treated being differently. But the group the conscious and the Soviet, these segments were already there. And there we saw a certain contradiction between the segment the conscious and other segments.
Ось. Ми задавали питання типу про
We asked
асоціації з
them questions about the
які
associations they have with Belarusians, Belarusian nation, and the segment The Conscious
Потім у 2021 годі,
spoke mostly negatively about this. In 2021, after the protest, we repeated this research survey, and we saw that a certain number of negative comments decreased twofold, which means that people became proud of their nation, of themselves, of Belarusians, and the situation improved. Among the Soviets, there were also changes. This segment decreased, and because part of the segment became disenchanted in the symbols that were close to them earlier. For example, the green, white flag, green, red flag. We used to ask people their opinion about the white, red, white flag, but we're not doing this anymore because they can be afraid to answer this question. But we're still asking people about the attitude towards the red-green flag, and some people have a negative association because of this, and now because of the violence that was conducted towards people under this flag in 2020.
Гэты ціск, які дзяржава зладзіла, про які вось Константин расказаў у папярэднім адказе пра рэпрэсіі, ён працаваў далей.
The authorities used by the authorities to treat people, particularly the conscious, resulted in them feeling themselves apart from others. It's not because proud people, but because of this pressure that they felt, because of the repression. It's not because of them being conceited. Then we saw how the war, fully fledged war, became part of the Belarusian conscience. So it became inbuilt in the existing social structure. Thus, the loyalty towards the state that existed actually showed that the people were also in favor of the war. So we saw a clear correlation. We saw the dynamics and the influence here. Since 2021, 2022, we have seen no significant change in the segments. But again, I must say we changed the methodology, and I cannot be 100% sure, but there have not been any significant changes in the Belarusian society since 2022 or 2021. Belarusian nation existed before 2021 and 2022, of course. And the certain segments inside this society have been competing for a long time now. Still, we can see things like brands and the cuisine and the music that unite Belarusians. They're there, these phenomena are there, and they show that the nation exists. You said that you surveyed the urban population. If we add rural population, how do you think the results would be different? To be honest, I don't know. I can only speculate. Using other research by other researchers, we can say that rural population is more conservative in Belarus.
нас асацыяваны вось больш праз з папярэдніх гадоў ведаем, што больш асацыяваны з савецкім
From the past, we know that the
беларуска-савецкім
conservatism is very much close to the
савецкім, ён беларуска-савецкі.
Belarusian Soviet project.
Спецыфічны від беларускага, які не блізкі.
It's a special kind of Belarusian that
зараз мяне здесь слухае. Вось, і
is not close to people, that dear to people who listen to me now. This conservatism
ён асацыюецца вось менавіта з гэтым
is associated with the national project. As I know, I think that if we conduct a similar research among the rural population, would have more people in the Soviet segment. Potentially, we would have more nationally indifferent people in the segment.
Таму што гэта больш пра лакальнае, так,
because it's more about the local, what is happening with the people here and now, not at the national level, while the conscious and the emergent groups find more interest in the cosmopolitan things. And I believe that the rural population would move our results towards the Soviet and the nationally indifferent. And if possible, this question to both of our speakers, what was the most unexpected thing you came across in this research, if anything?
Я почну.
I will start.
Константин, ты уже придумал что-то?
Maybe Konstantin is ready?
Нет? Окей, я почну. Дуже цікаво було дві речі.
It was interesting for me to know two things. First is that in the past we saw a very strong polarization in various research, particularly in the past, in the previous research of this, previous waves of this research, there was a clear-cut polarization between people who were in favor or against the regime. Well, this year, we saw that the group of the Soviets, now this can be confirmed by the Belarusian tracker of change that was presented here, which showed there's a shortening of the social distance between these two groups. The Soviets are more open now towards their opponents. This surprised me. I don't mean here that they're ready to hug and kiss each other, but only in the sense that there's some warming. As a person living outside Belarus, I cannot really feel it, but I'm being told about this by people who are inside the country and what I see inside of research. And I was surprised by this. And secondly, what was also surprising for me personally is that in the conscious segment, music, the popular music, among them is песняры. I thought песняры is the music enjoyed by
Мне падаецца, што гэта такі гімн савецкага нацыянальнага праекту. Там
такія people from who like the Soviet national project.
Савецкі нацыянальны праект. А я бачу, што песняры
sounds like Belarus. And here I see the segment of the conscious people says that песняры is the music that unites them and others. This was a bit surprising and unexpected for me. And the third is that the Russian culture affects Belarusians so weakly. So I expected it to affect Belarusians much stronger, in a much stronger way. We see that its influence is secondary if we compare it to the Western culture, the movies, for example. So this is my top 3 of things that were surprising to me. Konstantin, do you have anything that surprised you?
У меня какой-то такой идеи рассказать про что-то, что прям меня удивило, нету, поэтому я лучше не буду отнимать время.
Well, I wasn't planning to tell you much more about that, so I'm not going to take your time. Were there any geopolitical issues? Any questions about the union between Belarus and Russia this year? Well, this year we did not ask about this. We had one question for control, which ran as follows. Has anything changed? And nothing has changed. So the countries are more in favor of the EU. The Northern Ireland partially in favor of the EU and the union with Russia, and the Soviets are mostly aimed towards union with Russia and different also oriented towards Russia, but to a lesser degree. So there wasn't much of a change as such. So I think we conclude now. Thank you very much for your research. I'd like to thank the foundation of Friedrich-Ebert for making it possible. Thank you for staying with us and asking questions.
Щиро всім дякую.